Bitch, where's my money? If you want to help me out, you can subscribe to me on Patreon, which is Grimachu, on Subscribestar, which is Grim-Jim, or if you want to make a one-off donation to help support me and keep the channel going, you can do so at paypal.me/jdesborough. Thanks. So while you look at cute video of my cat, I'm going to hit you with something more serious. For some years now, I'm guessing about 5, maybe a little bit more, I have been advocating the idea that we can better persuade people, largely, by talking nicely to them, by treating them like human beings, by not treating them like idiots, just because they have a different political point of view to you. To an extent, I still feel that way. I don't think screaming fascist at people does much good, particularly when they're not actually fascists. But I don't think I've been particularly successful in persuading anyone of my point of view either, which is incredibly frustrating because the statistics, the science, the bald fact, the history and so on tends to be on my side for the most part, but that doesn't seem to persuade people. Now, when it comes to trying to proselytize left-wing political ideas, of course I'm trying to ice skate uphill to a large extent, because the prevailing narrative that is associated with the left is this authoritarian, bigoted, racist, nasty side. And so when I'm talking about egalitarianism and fairness and social investment and so on, that's not what people are seeing from the left. They're seeing white people bad, men bad. You're not allowed to speak on this subject, you're not allowed to make this art, you're not allowed to write this book, you're not allowed to make this social media post. And it's this constant tide of social ostracism and hatred and bile directed towards these people. So I'm going against the prevailing tide, trying to sell them on left-wing ideas like fairness, like equality, like social investment, like a certain baseline that we all should be able to expect. And I mean, that's disappointing in and of itself, because like I say, the statistics, the history, the science, to the extent that we have it, it's all on my side in these arguments. But everyone has their back up over something personal that has happened to them, something horrible that has happened to them, somewhere they've been banned or blockaded or fired, or everyone's got one of those stories, right? And that anecdote, that story is more powerful to them individually than any story I can tell, or any definition I can give, or any statistic I can offer up. So I don't think it's entirely my fault. But I did used to find in my arguments with creationists, which tend to run into the same kinds of problems, that sometimes if you can't persuade someone with the power of reason, logic, statistics, science, whatever, sometimes being horrible to them does work. Once you've tried everything else, if you can get someone's back up to the extent that they try to defend their ideas, and then realise that they can't when they do try to defend their ideas, sometimes that can get through to someone. And I give myself solace by saying that the argument isn't necessarily to persuade the person that you're arguing with, but perhaps to persuade someone else who happens to be watching the argument or stumbles upon it later. But I am very frustrated and out of patience after years of doing this, to have to continue to offer the same definitions, to offer the same evidence over and over again, even to the same people. It just doesn't feel like there's any progress, and I'm out of patience with it, especially staring down the barrel of an election here in the UK. Because if the Tories stay in, it's going to be a continued rollout of their welfare reforms, which are going to impoverish, starve and kill thousands of people. It means leaving the EU, which narrows everyone's horizons and impoverishes the country and affects all of us. You know, and yet I'm still running into people still making the argument that the EU is undemocratic after we had EU elections in the interim. or going on about the EU army, which was never ever a prospect in the first place, or talk about Turkey joining, which is still not a prospect whatsoever. It's just the same bullshit, and often from the same people who I've already shown all the statistics, all the rules that govern the EU, for example. You can lay it out in front of them, or climate change skepticism or pseudo-skepticism. You know, you can lay it all out right in front of people, and they're still going, it's snowing here, therefore no global warming. It's just this constant battle against bullshit, and there doesn't seem to be any give on the other side, on the people that I'm discussing with or arguing with. Even something so simple to lay out as the actual definition of socialism, you just can't even get people to acknowledge the definition, even when you literally cut and paste from a political reference text. It's just absolutely no willingness whatsoever. Or when you lay out the science and how multi-layered the evidence is on climate change, there's just nothing. And the thing is, that's really frustrating, is that a lot of this isn't even up for discussion anymore, really. I mean, contexts always change, technology changes, society is always shifting, but by and large we know certain things that I'm arguing for, like social investment is more cost effective than policing in reducing crime and deprivation and all manner of other issues. But people will still argue that they want more and more police on the beat, even though that's the least efficient and least effective form of policing that there is. And policing isn't particularly cost effective. Of course, you need a certain base level, obviously, but still. Or trying to argue for socialized medicine with an American, and there's just this mental block and they cannot comprehend or understand it, or even comprehend or understand the fact that they would be saving money if they had a national health service, that it would be much cheaper than the current private healthcare that they have. They just cannot compute. Or guns, right? There's a lovely contentious one, right? Everyone has their anecdote, or they can place themselves in an internal story situation where having a gun might save them from a home intruder or whatever. And there are individual cases where this might be so, but statistically you're much more at risk if you have a gun than if you don't have a gun. It ups the ante in confrontations, means you're more likely to end up dead. There's accidental shootings, children shooting each other, there's suicides, which are much more likely if you have a gun in the home because it's that much easier. All the bald statistics are there from multiple sources, both activist and non-activist, and yet they don't care. Because of that story, because of that narrative, because of that anecdote. It's backwards. Anecdotes aren't data, statistics are. Statistics should be more convincing, but they're not. And finding the story that will tap into that anecdotal side is difficult. I mean, you can point at times where people have shot themselves and people will just say, oh, well, I'd never do that. Or where someone's child shoots themselves or shoots a friend, well, I keep my guns locked up. There's always an anecdotal counter and always a way to ignore the broad swathe of statistics. Of course, it's not just guns. That means the US has 5 times the murder rate that the UK does. There's a whole bunch of other issues. But to pretend that it's not the guns at all is just nonsensical. I'm just frustrated, particularly since at the moment, staring down an election, a lot of this stuff directly affects me. It affects my story. It affects my anecdotal experience. And yet that anecdotal experience is also no good to persuade a lot of these people. It's very strange. Like the anti-immigrant sentiment in the UK, it's always about someone else, never about the immigrant talking to them or being involved. And after the incident on London Bridge, I'm seeing people crowing and even blaming the people who were stabbed because they were pro-diversity and spoken in its favour and so on. And there's some truly disgusting non-trolling comments about all of this. Oh, you brought this on yourselves. Basically, you know, if you're pro-diversity or you're pro-reform in the prison system, somehow you deserve to be murdered. I don't think that's true at all. And again, statistically, we can look at the statistics and we can see that a softer, more reformist version of a justice system tends to have better outcomes. There are always going to be bad individual headline-grabbing cases, but the people who quietly reform themselves and get on with their lives don't make the headlines, but they do make the statistics. So I don't know. How do you persuade people anymore? Nobody trusts anything. Not statistics, not your anecdotes, only their own anecdotes and fictions, which seem to be utterly impenetrable to either facts or counter-narratives. So I don't know. I am frustrated and I'm angered and I'm annoyed, especially as a lot of this stuff now potentially directly affects me personally. So people advocating for things like Brexit or voting Conservative are genuinely and actually threatening me and people I love and care about. And while I'm good at keeping a tamp on my emotions most of the time, I'm slipping. But for good reason, I think. Zang. Pulp Nova is a collection of short stories in the old pulp style but with a modern twist. You should find something here you like, from western to mythos horror to science fiction. You can get Pulp Nova at Drive-Thru Fiction, on Amazon, or in hard copy from lulu.com.